Okay, so this video will be about understanding. So what understanding is, why do we need to understand, as well as a demonstration of how understanding in science looks like. So before we begin, we need to know why understanding is so important. And this will be elaborated in the first section. So basically, the exams do not test how much you have memorized, but how well you understand the science topic. So there is a difference here between memorization as well as understanding. Just because I've put here in the statement that understanding is important as compared to memorization does not mean that you do not memorize, but you need to do both, memorize and understand. So after you memorize, you need to understand. Both of these terms cannot be separated, and for the exams you have to memorize and understand, because if you only memorize, you are unable to apply the knowledge that you have memorized. And if you only memorize, you will not be able to use the knowledge, which then only becomes pieces of information, which is rather useless. Alright, so moving on. What does it mean to understand something? So over here, we will be talking about the meaning of understanding. Alright, the meaning of understanding. So before we can understand something, we need to know what does it mean to understand. So firstly, there are two definitions of understanding within science. Alright, so firstly, knowing how things work and being able to apply this knowledge in different situations. So I've bracketed here understanding within topics. So what I mean by this is that when you refer to your guidebooks or when you refer to your textbooks, there are different sections that go within the chapter. You need to know and you need to understand how these different sections relate to each other. Only after you have known how they relate to each other will you be able to understand and apply this knowledge when it comes to different questions. Let me give you an example. So let's take a look at the example of gravitational forces. Alright, so there are many parts when we are looking at the guidebook when it talks about gravitational forces. Firstly, it tells you what gravitational forces is, which is the definition, and then it goes on to tell you factors affecting gravity, and then it goes on to tell you the difference between mass and weight. So these three sections within the topic of gravitational forces need to be understood as working with each other. They relate to each other. You cannot simply just memorize the definition and then memorize the factors affecting, and then you memorize the difference between mass and weight. When you do that, you are unable to answer questions which, for example, talk about these two parts together, that talk about these two parts together, or talk about these three parts together. If you only know how they work alone, you will not be able to answer questions that talk about these three parts as they work together. Let me give you an example. So an example would be factors affecting gravity. So as we have mentioned in another video, it is mass and it is distance. So these two affect the amount of gravitational gravitational force. So based on knowing these two as well as this gravitational force, you are able to answer this last group here, the difference between mass and weight. So you know that since mass affects gravitational force, which affects weight, then mass is not equal to weight. Rather, mass affects the gravitational force, which then determines the amount of force which produces the weight. So based on this example, you see the two different sections interacting with each other. If I were to just only simply memorize the definition of gravitational force as the attraction between two objects, and then someone goes on to ask me, how is mass different from weight? Am I going to repeat the definition to them? No matter how many times you repeat the definition to them, you are not answering the question. And when you are unable to answer the question, that shows that you do not understand what you have studied. So, learning how the different sections interact with each other and how they relate to each other is very, very important. Alright, so the second definition of understanding is being able to make links between topics. So the first one is understanding within topics. So it's within one topic. Then the next one would be between topics. So between different topics. For example, the topic of light and plants. So we know that plants need light to photosynthesize. So light is a form of energy. So they need this light energy to photosynthesize in order to produce chemical potential energy, which is stored within them. So you see how these topics are linked together. So you will need to know what about plants that allows them to carry out this process. And that answer would be the chlorophyll. So for example, let's say my question now talks about a root hair cell. Alright, so in the experiment, I expose a root hair cell to light energy. Would this produce any chemical potential energy? The answer is no, because we know roots do not have chlorophyll. So over here, we can link the topic of energy and plant parts. So you need to be able to draw these linkages between different topics, and this takes time. So you need to put in the effort to see how different topics relate to each other. For example, the topic of heat and water cycle, they are linked. So you need to know how to explain heat in terms of water cycle, or how the water cycle is affected by heat. Alright. So I figured that by this time, you might be scratching your head like this guy in the photo here. You don't get it, so you need an example, right? Although I've given examples just now, I will give you further examples so as to help you in your journey of being better students, as well as helping yourself understand the content. All right, so basically, let's look at the first definition, which is understanding within topics. Okay, basically, it is knowing how information in each chapter links to each other, as I have mentioned earlier. Let's look at this sample question from the chapter of magnets. So let's take a look at question 39C. The maglev train shown in the diagram below is the fastest train in the world and can travel at a speed of 500 kilometers an hour. Instead of running on wheels, the maglev train works on magnetic force. So the maglev train works on magnetic force. Let us highlight that. Strong electromagnets can be found at the bottom of the maglev train and on the train tracks. So bottom of the maglev train and train tracks. These strong electromagnets help the maglev train levitate or float above the train tracks, as shown in the diagram below. So you can see over here the electromagnets on the maglev train and also on the train tracks. So if we look at question 39C, what is it asking us? Explain how the electromagnets help the maglev train to float above the train tracks. So explain this floating, how the electromagnets result in the floating. So firstly, this question is asking you about electromagnets and how they help the train to float above the tracks. So what do we know about magnets that allows them to float? So we know that floating is basically two magnets repelling each other, right? So there's a force of repulsion there. So when does repulsion happen? When two magnets, or when do magnets repel each other? When light poles are facing each other. So for example, your north and your north, your south and your south. Okay, those are light poles. If you don't know, please revise. If you don't understand the topic of magnets, if you understood the topic of magnets, you will be able to link your knowledge that, firstly, electromagnets are a form of magnets, therefore they must have poles. So magnets have two poles. When the same poles meet, like we mentioned just now, like poles, then they will repel or float. So we are piecing together these different pieces of information from the topic of magnets in order to answer this question of how do electromagnets allow the train to float. So now we have to craft a scientific answer. So crafting a scientific answer over here, let's take a look. The question asks me to explain. Therefore, I need to provide details on how this floating process happens. So my answer would sound something like this. They help the train float above the train tracks through light poles of the magnet of the train and the tracks facing and repelling each other. So this is a good answer because firstly, it tells me that for repelling to happen, you need to have light poles. So for repelling to happen, you need to have light poles and they need to face each other. So then the question is, where are your electromagnets found? So we have found out in the question that below train and on tracks. So for example, north, you will repel and then you will float. So we see how our answer here takes us from a step-by-step manner. So firstly, we mentioned that light poles, and then we mentioned where the magnets are, and then thirdly, we mentioned how the magnets needs to be placed. So if we were to have a conversation, if someone asks me, when do magnets repel? So I can say to them, magnets repel when light poles are facing and repelling each other. So for example, if someone is showing me a particular experiment which has magnets, then I would point out to them the light poles of the magnet within the experiment. So in this example, we have light poles at the bottom of the train and light poles at the on the train tracks, and they are facing each other and repelling. So I give you more detail and I take you step by step. I don't just say electromagnets help the train to float because they repel each other. That is a very, very bad answer, because it straight away jumps into the repelling, and you do not tell your readers about what conditions are necessary. So do take note of that. Alright, so in this section we have covered understanding within topics. Now I'll move on to the next section, which is understanding between topics. So between two topics. So we will be looking at the section D over here. So give a reason why maglev trains can travel faster than normal trains with wheels. So we need to give a reason. So give a reason, referring to one reason. Don't give like 6 reasons. Let's think. Why is using magnets and floating faster than normal trains and wheels? What is the difference between magnets and floating and wheels and tracks? So floating versus wheel and tracks. The difference is that when we use floating, we are using magnetic force, and there is less contact between the train tracks. So we have the idea that when there is less contact, it will be faster. So less contact, it will be faster. But we don't have a reason why. So we have to ask ourselves, based on everything that we've learned throughout the PSLE syllabus, which topic talks about contact between two surfaces and speed? So we think, oh, that is the chapter on forces, and in specific, the section on frictional forces. So we know that contact between the wheels and track produces friction, and friction opposes motion. Therefore, when we use electromagnets, there is less friction, less opposing force, and can move faster. That is a good answer right there. So you might be wondering, how is this relationships between two topics? So firstly, we need to know about magnets, right? Because we know that magnets, when they repel, they do not touch each other. So we know that the train is not touching the tracks. And then the second part about forces, we know that making contact will give you friction, and friction will make you slower. So you need to combine both 1 and 2. And the link between these two areas is overcoming frictional force by reducing contact through magnetic force. So by using magnetic force, there is no contact. So you reduce contact and you overcome frictional force. So both here, this question is not simply asking you about forces, but it is asking you to apply your knowledge on magnets and magnetic force to frictional force. So the topic of magnets and forces are interacting here. So if you are just going to simply memorize bits and pieces of information, what if you get questions which talk about two topics that link to each other? You will not be able to answer them because you did not practice but simply just memorize and hope that your memory will be able to produce something during the exam. That is a risk that you shouldn't take because it is a stupid risk. Alright, so in the final section, before I conclude, what you have learned from this video is that you know what it means to understand. And you have learned the two definitions of understanding: understanding within topics and understanding between topics. So in order to understand, you need to draw the links between different topics and pieces of information in your textbook, notes, and guidebooks. You cannot just think you know, or you think that you've heard this word before and therefore you know. You need to check. As the saying goes, before I end, familiarity breeds complacency. So this is what I've been emphasizing throughout this video. Just because you think you heard that word or you think you know doesn't mean that you know, because you need to check for your understanding by doing practices. Okay, so practice and you will know what you don't know. Because if you cannot answer something, then it shows that you don't know and you need to revise. Alright, so that is the end of my video today. Please do revise because only you can help yourself. Alright, goodbye.